It is 5:30 in the morning on April 9th, 1917, and the ground itself is shaking. Snow is falling sideways across a shattered ridge in northern France, mixing with sleet and smoke until the whole world seems to be made of gray static. In the trenches below Vimy Ridge, thousands of Canadian soldiers press their bodies against the mud and wait. Somewhere behind them, nearly 1,000 guns open fire in the same instant, and the noise does not arrive as a sound so much as a physical blow, something felt in the chest before it is heard in the ears. Then the whistles go, and the men climb out of the earth and start walking forward into the dark, following a wall of exploding shells that creeps ahead of them like a curtain being drawn back on a stage no one has ever seen before. Within hours, a ridge that had defeated the French army and cost them an estimated 150,000 casualties, a ridge the British had also tried and failed to take, was in Canadian hands. German officers who had spent 2 years assuring their men that Vimy could never fall watched their defensive lines collapse in a single morning. For the first time in the war, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps had fought together as one force, and they had done something that had seemed, to everyone who had studied that stretch of high ground, close to impossible. This is the story of how they did it, and why the shock of that morning rippled far beyond the ridge itself. To understand why Vimy Ridge mattered so much, you have to understand what it was and what it had already cost. The ridge rises perhaps 60 meters above the Douai Plain in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region, a modest height by any ordinary standard, but on the flat agricultural land of northern France it was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the entire Western Front. Whoever held it could see for miles in every direction, could direct artillery fire onto anything that moved below, and could deny the enemy the same advantage. The Germans had captured it in October 1914, in the war's opening months, and had spent the following 2.5 years turning it into one of the most heavily fortified positions in Europe. They dug 3 defensive lines, one behind the other, connected by tunnels blasted through the chalky ground. They built concrete machine gun emplacements disguised as farmhouse ruins. They laid belts of barbed wire in some places 30 meters deep. Nothing about Vimy Ridge was accidental. It had been engineered, over years, to be unbreakable. The French had tried first, in May 1915, as part of the Second Battle of Artois. They advanced with extraordinary courage and, for a few hours, actually reached the crest, only to be driven back by German counterattacks and devastating artillery fire directed from the high ground itself. Estimates of French losses across the broader campaign for the ridge run as high as 150,000 men, an almost incomprehensible figure for a piece of ground that could be walked across in 20 minutes. The failure became a symbol of everything wrong with the war's early tactics. Massed infantry sent forward against dug-in defenders with insufficient artillery support and no coherent plan for what to do if they actually broke through. The British took over that section of the line in 1916 and made their own limited attempts, including detonating enormous underground mines beneath German positions, but they too failed to dislodge the defenders from the ridge's dominant heights. By the beginning of 1917, Vimy had acquired a reputation. Soldiers on both sides spoke of it almost superstitiously, as ground that simply could not be taken by conventional means. The problem was not a lack of courage. Both French and British soldiers had shown plenty of that, often at devastating cost. The problem was that no one had yet worked out how to combine artillery, infantry, and intelligence into something that could actually crack a fortress this deep and this well prepared. Attempts up to that point had followed a grimly familiar pattern across the whole of the Western Front. A lengthy preliminary bombardment intended to cut wire and destroy trenches, followed by infantry advancing in rigid lines at a walking pace, on the assumption that nothing could have survived the shelling. Time and again, that assumption proved false. German dugouts at Vimy were carved deep into the chalk, in places more than 10 meters below the surface, deep enough to shelter defenders through days of bombardment, and the moment the shelling lifted, Machine gun crews could climb back up their ladders and be in position before the first attacking soldier had crossed no man's land. The result, at the Somme in 1916 and at countless smaller actions before it, was slaughter on a scale that had begun to feel almost routine, and it left commanders on both sides of the Channel searching for a method that did not simply repeat the same catastrophic arithmetic. That was the puzzle handed to the Canadian Corps in the early months of 1917, and it is worth pausing to note that nobody expected them to solve it. 4 divisions of colonial troops, most of them volunteers rather than professional soldiers, farmers and clerks and laborers from across a young dominion barely 50 years old, were not the obvious candidates to succeed where 2 of the world's great armies had already failed. Some in the British High Command privately doubted whether colonial troops, however brave, possessed the discipline for an operation demanding this degree of precision. That skepticism, as it turned out, badly underestimated both the men involved and the officers now given the freedom to plan the assault their own way. What changed the equation was not raw courage, though there was plenty of that too, but method. The planning for Vimy was overseen by Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, the British officer commanding the Canadian Corps, working closely with his Canadian subordinate, Major General Arthur Currie, who had personally traveled to study the recent French experience at Verdun and returned convinced that meticulous preparation, not raw aggression, was the key to breaking a fortified position. Together, they built what amounted to an entirely new template for offensive warfare. Every single soldier, down to the level of individual privates, was shown maps and scale models of the ground they would be crossing and briefed on the specific objectives of not just their battalion, but their platoon. Behind the lines, engineers built full-scale replicas of the German trench system using tape and flags, and entire battalions rehearsed the attack again and again until the movements became close to instinctive, so that if officers were killed, ordinary soldiers would already know exactly where to go and what to do. Before the main assault, Currie also insisted on an aggressive program of trench raiding through the winter of 1916 and into early 1917, sending small parties of Canadian soldiers out at night to capture prisoners, snatch documents, and probe the German wire for weaknesses. These raids were dangerous, costly in their own right, and unpopular with the men who had to carry them out, but they built up an extraordinarily detailed picture of the German defensive system, layer by layer, that no amount of aerial photography alone could have provided. By the time the main assault was launched, Canadian intelligence officers had a clearer picture of the enemy's trench layout, gun positions, and unit dispositions than any attacking force had possessed at any earlier point in the war. The artillery plan was, in its own way, the single most important technical innovation of the battle. Canadian and British gunners fired what became known as the creeping barrage, a wall of shell fire that advanced in carefully timed increments just ahead of the infantry, so that attacking troops could walk close behind the explosions and reach German positions before the defenders had time to climb out of their dugouts and man their machine guns. Getting the timing right required extraordinary precision. Move the barrage forward too quickly and the infantry would face fully alert defenders, too slowly, and your own men risked being caught in their own shell fire. Roughly 1 gun was in place for every 20 meters of front, an astonishing concentration of firepower for the period. And in the days before the assault, these guns fired a preparatory bombardment so heavy that German soldiers nicknamed the preceding week the Week of Suffering. Just as significant, though far less visible, was the work of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, who pioneered techniques of counter-battery fire using sound ranging and flash spotting to locate German artillery positions with a precision that had simply not existed earlier in the war. Imagine trying to silence an orchestra hidden somewhere across a valley, using only the sound of each instrument and the flash of light from a conductor's baton to work out exactly where each musician is standing, and then landing a shell squarely on that spot. That is roughly the scale of the technical challenge McNaughton's team solved, and it meant that when the infantry went forward on April 9th, a great many German guns that should have been raking the advancing lines had already been destroyed or silenced. Beneath all of this, quite literally, was another feat of engineering. Tunneling companies dug a network of subways through the chalk beneath no man's land, some of them large enough to move troops, supplies, and even light rail lines completely out of sight of German observers, allowing thousands of men to reach their jumping-off positions without ever being exposed to fire. The largest of these, the Grange Tunnel, still exists today and can be walked by visitors to the site. Above ground, the Canadians also made use of the recently developed Livens projector, a crude but effective mortar-like device for firing gas canisters, and coordinated machine gun barrages fired indirectly over the heads of advancing troops, adding yet another layer to what had become, by the standards of 1917, an almost symphonic combination of different weapon systems working in concert rather than in isolation. The scale of the bombardment that preceded the attack is difficult to convey in modern terms. Over the 2 weeks before April 9th, the guns supporting the Canadian Corps fired more than 1 million shells onto the German positions along the ridge, a rate of expenditure that strained the entire Allied supply chain and required an almost continuous stream of ammunition lorries moving up from railheads behind the lines. German soldiers holding the front trenches endured this bombardment with almost no relief, living for days at a time in dugouts that shook constantly with the concussion of nearby explosions, their food and water supplies frequently cut off by shell fire targeting the communication trenches behind them. It is little wonder that some German accounts describe men emerging from that week of shelling in a state close to shock, their nerves worn through before a single Canadian soldier had even left his own trench. When the attack finally came, it unfolded largely as planned, though not without difficulty. 3 of the 4 Canadian divisions reached their initial objectives well within schedule, in some sectors advancing through positions that had resisted years of previous attempts within a matter of hours. The 4th Division, tasked with the highest and most heavily defended portion of the ridge known as Hill 145, met ferocious resistance and required additional days of hard fighting before the position was finally secured, with the neighboring outcrop known as the Pimple falling to Canadian troops on April 12th after further bitter close-quarters combat. Soldiers who survived the assault described the strange, almost dreamlike quality of walking forward behind the barrage in the falling snow, watching German defenders emerge from dugouts stunned and disoriented, some surrendering almost immediately, having simply never experienced an assault delivered with this degree of coordination. German accounts from the sector describe confusion bordering on disbelief. Positions that commanders had been assured were secure were being overrun before reserves could even be brought forward, and officers who had spent 2 years telling their men the ridge could not fall now had to explain, in the space of a single morning, how it had. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. It is worth placing the Canadian achievement alongside what else was happening on the Western Front that same week, because the contrast sharpens exactly what made Vimy different. Just days after the Canadian assault, the French launched the Nivelle offensive further south along the Chemin des Dames, an operation built on wildly optimistic assumptions about how quickly entrenched German positions could be broken. It failed catastrophically, with French casualties running into the hundreds of thousands and triggering widespread mutinies within the French army that took months to fully suppress. The Germans themselves had, by 1917, developed their own doctrine of elastic defense in depth, deliberately thinning their front lines and relying on rapid counterattacks by reserves held further back, a system that worked well against less carefully prepared assaults but which the meticulous Canadian planning, particularly the speed with which objectives were consolidated and reinforced, was specifically designed to defeat. British attempts elsewhere along the front in the same general period, including later phases of the Battle of Arras of which Vimy was technically a part, achieved far more modest and costly gains using less thoroughly rehearsed methods. What set the Canadian effort apart was not any single piece of equipment, since the guns, the gas, and the tunnels were all in use elsewhere on the front as well, but the degree to which every element had been integrated into a single rehearsed system, and the unusual insistence, driven particularly by Curry, that every soldier understand the plan well enough to keep functioning even if his officers became casualties. German assessments written after the battle and later German defensive doctrine show clear evidence that the lessons of Vimy, particularly around counter-battery fire and small unit initiative, were studied and absorbed by the German army for the remainder of the war. The material impact of Vimy Ridge on the broader war was, if historians are honest, more limited than the drama of the assault might suggest. The ridge itself did not lead to the immediate collapse of German defenses further along the front, and the wider Battle of Arras, of which Vimy formed only the opening phase, eventually bogged down into the same kind of costly stalemate that characterized so much of the war. But the psychological and symbolic impact was enormous and has proven, over the following century, to be considerably more durable than any immediate tactical gain. For the first time, the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps had gone into battle as a single formation, rather than being parceled out to support British operations, and the shared experience of planning, training, and fighting together produced an emerging sense of national identity that Canadian historians have long argued was genuinely transformative. The phrase often used, that Canada came of age as a nation on Vimy Ridge, remains debated, but reflects something real about how the battle was understood at the time and has been remembered since. The methods pioneered there, the creeping barrage refined to a fine art, the systematic counter-battery work, the emphasis on training every soldier to think and act independently, were studied and adapted by other Allied forces for the remainder of the war and influenced military doctrine well beyond 1918. Today, the ridge itself is preserved as a Canadian National Historic Site, its preserved trenches and tunnels open to visitors, its cratered ground still fenced off in places because of the risk of unexploded ordnance more than a century later, and the great limestone monument designed by Walter Allward, unveiled in 1936 and inscribed with the names of over 11,000 Canadian soldiers with no known grave, stands on the highest point of the ridge as perhaps the most visited Canadian memorial anywhere in the world. It is worth returning, finally, to that gray, sleet-soaked morning of April 9, 1917, because the image with which we began contains, in miniature, everything that made this assault so shocking to the men who tried to stop it. It was not one clever trick or one new weapon that took Vimy Ridge. It was the sheer patient thoroughness of men who had studied every previous failure and refused to repeat it. Where the French had thrown courage at the problem and lost 150,000 men, the Canadians brought maps, models, rehearsals, and a level of coordination between infantry and artillery that had simply not existed on this scale before. Where the Germans had built a fortress they believed could not fall, they had not reckoned on an enemy willing to spend months rehearsing the exact choreography of its capture down to the smallest platoon. The ridge fell in hours where it had held for years, and it fell not because the men who took it were braver than those who had died trying before them, though they were extraordinarily brave, but because they were better prepared. Nearly 3,600 Canadian soldiers were killed in the assault, and more than 7,000 were wounded. Costs that remain sobering, however the battle is remembered, and it is worth saying plainly that no tactical brilliance erases the weight of those losses. But amid the horror of the wider war, Vimy Ridge stands as a case study in what happens when planning, technology, and human courage are combined with genuine care rather than thrown together in haste. The Germans, who watched their impregnable ridge fall in a single gray morning, understood, perhaps before anyone else did, that something had changed in how this war would be fought. A fortress 2.5 years in the building had lasted less than a day against men who had simply refused to accept that it could not be taken.